Good evening. I would like to call to order the special board meeting for November 26th. Ms. Shope, may we please get a roll call?
Yes. Megan Miller.
Present.
Tom Hankins.
Here.
Brian Anderson.
Brian Anderson, can you hear us?
I'm sorry, here.
Brian Nichols.
Here.
Amy Levy.
Here.
And Greg Schneider. I believe he's unavailable this evening. So all members are present except Greg Schneider.
Thank you, Ms. Shope. May I get an approval of the agenda?
So moved. Second.
Motion for approval by Brian Nichols, seconded by Tom Hankins. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Our first item tonight is a brief overview of the 2025-26 budget. We have presenting tonight Dr. Garrison and Bob Chady, and the purpose of this is to provide an estimate of the budget, including estimated deficit, to help determine a baseline for referendum needs. The board members should understand that these numbers may not be exact due to additional preparation of the budget. Mr. Chady?
Thank you. As I get the presentation open, I'll just ask Dr. Garrison if he'd like to open it first and foremost.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chady. So one of the things I want to make sure that everyone is clearly aware of, as Mrs. Board President Johnson has already read, is that we are in not necessarily the infancy of the conversation around the budget building, but we have started to work on our budget for the next school year. And this presentation is really geared towards us making sure that we have some general information ready for the board to make considerations around. As we kind of work through this conversation, please note that there are some variables that we haven't settled on, some things that the board will need to decide on, some things that we also need to input, which again builds out our model. This is a very brief conversation. And the main thing about this conversation is, again, just to let the board know that as we put certain variables into the model, things will change. And so Mr. Chady will take us through two of the presentations that we kind of worked through over this past week or two here. One being, well, actually, I'll let Mr. Chady work us through the process. But again, the two models that we kind of worked on over these past 2 weeks kind of shows us a snapshot of around what our budget could look like next year going into the 2025-2026 school year. I'll turn it over to Mr. Chady.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. As Dr. Garrison alluded, and as the board write-up spoke about as well, this presentation is really kind of designed to give you a high-level overview of the ballpark of what the financial challenges are. I was speaking with a board member earlier this afternoon about the presentation, and we kind of talked a little bit in terms of an analogy about, hitting the dartboard. So I think the numbers that we're going to look at today are on the dartboard, but they're far from the bullseye. So we still have a lot of refinement yet to do. But let me just kind of talk through what we've got here in the budget model. So a couple of things. The board members have a copy at your table. Those that are viewing at home, it was emailed to board members here around noon, if I recall correctly, today as well, and I do have a few extra. If you guys would like a copy, I've got one here for you too. So we've got two scenarios here. If you look at the top half of your page, it's kind of in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see it labeled as base. And what that base scenario is, thank you. Yeah, thanks. So what that base scenario does is it's pretty straightforward and simple. It's by far from accurate, but it gives us a good speculation as to what our challenges are. So what the base scenario does is we assumed a 3% increase to all expenses from the 24-25 budget, with the exception of health insurance. In health insurance, we budgeted as an 8% increase, which, to be very honest with you, may not be sufficient. We'll find out as we go throughout the budget building process. So kind of straightforward, 3% across the board for all expenses, including salaries and wages, and then 8% in health insurance. So that's kind of what that top half, that base scenario looks at. In comparison then, the bottom portion of the page, you can see they're labeled as scenario 1 in that upper right corner. The difference between the two is in scenario 1, we reduced the 3% increase for salaries and wages to 2.12%. That's essentially the value of the step movement or that row movement for the BEA members, much like how the board applied that increase in 24-25 to the BEA and all other staff as well. All the other variables remain the same as the base, so everything else reflects that 3% increase, except for the health insurance, which reflects an 8% increase. And as I discussed in the email that I sent to the board, I color-coded some rows just to kind of help board members look scenario to scenario. So in light blue, Fund 10 total salary increases, you can see 3% in the base, 2.12% in all the years going forward in scenario 1. In the orange highlighted row, you'll see that surplus. We only wish it was a surplus. It's actually a deficit amount. So you can see the deficit in each year. It's important to note that those deficits are annual deficits for those years. So it's not like if you're looking at this and you're looking at the base in 25-26, we have a $3.9 million deficit, and you're looking forward to 26-27, seeing that it's only a $5.2 million deficit. That does not mean that the deficit is only a $1.3 million. It's a true $5.2 million deficit in that year. So it kind of compounds upon itself. In pink, the highlighted rows reflecting fund balance, and you can see the fund balance, and the row immediately below that is the as percent of expenditures. Again, our school board policy speaks to 18% fund balance. It's been a number of years since we've been above that threshold. With the current trajectory, we're looking to fully expend our fund balance in the 27-28 school year under either scenario, unless we make continued significant reductions in our programming, or we seek additional revenues, or some combination of the two. And speaking of the additional revenues, if you're looking at the models, you'll see a couple of rows highlighted in green, non-recurring referendum dollar amount and recurring referendum dollar amount. And you'll note in both of the scenarios that are presented there, it's listed as 0 across the board. But if we were to go for, or as we start building scenarios that kind of consider what perhaps might be the value necessary to help close the gap with the deficit, we can put that in, and it'll show up in the models here to give us an idea as to which years and then how that impacts on the surplus and the deficit, that orange row above. So a couple of other comments that I'll make about the budget models as presented tonight, and then I'll be more than happy to take a couple of questions. So let's see here. Which way do I want to do this first? Let's talk about it here first. So first and foremost, this was a relatively simple and quick attempt to kind of ballpark what our financial position is and looks like for the next few years. I will note that this really it's not based at all upon the district goals with regards to helping to resolve or overcome student behavioral issues, trying to close the gap with regards to student achievement, nor does it attend to the teacher retention and recruitment challenges that the district has. So those three district goals may very well require some additional resources or reprioritization of resources in order to help hit those marks over time. Not factored into these two budget scenarios yet at all. So just to put that on the table for everyone. The second item that I would note is that we do have some capital improvement maintenance needs across the district. And on Tuesday at the committee level, Tommy Bricko, our Director of Facilities, will provide an overview of some of those needs. Those needs are also not baked into either of these scenarios. So we know that there's some projects that need some work, perhaps some stuff that we can defer, but I think there's one item that comes with $1 million+ price tag that probably needs to move forward sooner than later. So again, how we attend to that is still to be determined. Coming back and looking at the surplus amounts, it's often thought, how do you go about structuring a referendum? And there's so many different ways that we can do it if it is something that the board seeks to proceed forward with. But if you look at like the base scenario, the district over the last 2 years has worked off of a 3-year non-recurring referendum ask. So if we look at those 3 years of deficits, 3.9 million, 5.2 million, and 6.1 million, you add those up, and it's just over $15.2 million. And you can essentially take that 15.2, kind of divide it by 3, and you end up, 5 million, just over that, as a potential ask amount. In that, we have to have some flexibility as we continue to refine the model. But if you're looking at, trying to foresee what the potential ask or need is, I think that $5 million mark kind of puts us in perspective. Board Member Levy has talked about a 4-year referendum, non-recurring for 4 years. I like that logic. I like how that can align and tie to student achievement over the years as well. And if we add up the 4 years for the base model, it comes out to just under $22.9 million. So you divide that by 4, and again, you're in that 5.5, can be approaching 6, perhaps million mark as well. So the thing to keep in mind is that as you tack on additional years, there's really 2 things to remember. One, the potential ask amount, the cost of the referendum that you're asking the taxpayers to support is going to go up. And then 2, the other word of caution that I would say is that the further out you get from the current year and the following year, the less reliable the data or the integrity of the data is. Trying to forecast out what's going to happen 4 years from now becomes a little bit more challenging. 3 years, higher degree, 2 years, higher. But at the same token, if we're going to be looking at operating referendum, we have to balance the time and the cost that it goes into planning for and advocating, educating the public against the reward over time as well. So, I hate to say it, but there are districts that do it every year. I don't think Beloit wants to be there. 2 years is probably too short. 3 or 4 years I could live with. 5 years I wouldn't go anywhere near. So just, something for the board and the community to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Cheney. Sorry.
Yeah, just one other quick comment, and then I'll let Dr. Garrison jump in, and we'll address some questions. So Also on the phone call I had this afternoon with a board member, if you look at the models, there is a row towards the bottom. It's about an inch up on each model scenario. It is entitled Referendum Debt Levy. And if you look towards the middle of the page, you'll see a row that has $105,213 running for 4 years and then an $840,000 value. Do myself a favor, take your pen or pencil and just line through all of that. It shouldn't be in there. We didn't catch it until after it was produced and as I was looking at it this afternoon. So let's just kind of line through that so that it's not there in both scenarios, just to kind of bring that back. And the reason why it doesn't need to be there is because that's our Fund 39 debt service levy. The values that are there are pulled from the DPI with regards to our future debt schedule, but we have sufficient assets on hand in our Fund 39 fund balance to cover those future liability payments. If you recall correctly, earlier this year in the preliminary budget, we had about $105,000 in there as a tax levy in Fund 39 that we removed because we recognized that we had the assets on hand. So in striking those values, the mill rate number, the last row in each of the scenarios, will go down marginally. It won't go down significantly. I mean, we're probably talking it goes down by maybe 3 or 4 cents is all. But just to kind of put that out there for you as well. So, Dr. Garrison, I'll let you take it from there, and then we'll see if anyone has any questions.
No, actually, I was going to turn it over to the board for any questions. Again, this is a brief overview. Naturally, our hopes is that as the days go by, we will have a tighter understanding around this. Some variables we won't have the exact information about. And so the board can make certain decisions. Some things are just a little far out to determine. So here we are. Hopefully this gives you all a snapshot, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Johnson for board questions.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison, and thank you, Mr. Chady, for doing such a nice job on this and understanding a brief overview. And this is exactly what we were looking for. Do any board members have any questions? Mr. Hankins?
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chady and administration for putting this together. As I understand it, and again, I was not a board member last year, but I sat in the audience and looked at these Baird projections, and projections are projections. They're, made on historical data, and you project them forward. Last year, during this negotiation period, or not negotiation, but fact-finding time on the ask for the referendum, as I sat in the audience, I looked at 3 different projections. I believe the projections were, and I can't remember, one was 12.9, one was 11, and the other one was 9, which, due to research, they thought that was the more acceptable one. So that failed. So here we are now. We trimmed that off, and I agree. I think that we're back to where we should have gone. And moving forward, my point is projections are projections. And I'm not in favor of going on models. I understand the 3% and the 2.12, and yes, things are going to go up. I'm just not married to some of the numbers as you project them forward, because a lot of things are not answered, and I'm giving that. But so I guess my brief overview is Beloit is Beloit is Beloit, and our projections are based on what happened last year. I just think these Baird models are somewhat not real, because, like last year, and those 3 numbers that I saw had nothing to do with what happened last year. And it's what they wanted, and maybe admin wanted, but it's not what happened. So anyways, let's just move past that point. But my question to you, Mr. Chady, is, and I thank you for answering that one on the referendum, or no, the fund balance, because I saw that too. Another one is on the go up to the first set, TIF out equalized valuation growth. It goes from 16 to 7 to 0. What is that number?
So that row is the valuation change, the overall district valuation change. In what that will do is that will impact the mill rate, the very last row in each of the scenarios. And again, I didn't touch on that. So when we worked in the model, the only thing I focused on were expenses. There were no changes to revenues, no changes to pupil count. You can see that in the top row. September FTE membership stays the same for every year going forward. We wish that to be the case, yet we know that that's unlikely to happen, so we need to adjust that as well. And then, so if you look at 23-24, the district's overall equalized valuation is certified by the Department of Revenue, increased by 16.07%. Here in the current 24-25 school year, it went up 7.39%. We know it's not going to be zero. You know, do we put in there a 5% or what? Doing that, again, the only factor that changes when we adjust that will be the mill rate at the very bottom of each of the scenarios. I'll also speak about your comments about the values that were considered last year. Those values did not come out of the Baird budget model. They came out independently prior to our district arriving at the Baird budget model and being able to utilize it. Your comments speak a little bit about concerns about the integrity of the model, and I would say that it has a very, very high degree of integrity. It's used by probably more than half of the districts throughout the state. So the model's good. What changes with the model is what the input is. You know, much like any type of data integrity system, bad data in, you get bad data out. So we try to put good data in, but who knows, right? I mean, in the base scenario, we use a 3% increase. CPI for July 1st, 2025 seems to be around that amount currently, but that 3% is also used in 26, 27, 27, 28, 28, 29, and 29, 30. I have no idea what CPI is going to be the next 4 years. You know, so the key about this is that we have to have some understanding of the variables that we use and put into the model, because that then helps us all have a greater understanding and appreciation for the output that we get, the data that comes out, and the numbers that we're looking at. You know, Beloit, I think, has a very traditional mindset of looking at next year. You know, what's 25, 26 looking like for us? That's so short-sighted. We need to be looking at least 3 years out. You know, and this model is projecting 5 years out for us, because it's important for us to look at what those financial challenges are. The other thing that I'll add as well is that keep in mind, starting July 1st, 2025, the state will enter into a new biennial budget cycle. The board's anticipating and expecting a preliminary budget to come before the board in the month of June, which is fine. Understand that. We're not going to know what we're going to get from state resources and revenues with regards to the upcoming budget cycle until probably the last week of June, if not into July. So the Joint Finance Committee won't even take up work on the public education publicly until probably Memorial Day and thereafter. And by that point in time, the April referendum will be past us, a preliminary budget. So there's just these oddities that we're going to face this year. We can put forward an operating referendum request and the public will chastise us and, throw out there about all the new state resources that we may or may not get. We won't know, nor will they. So, we have to have some flexibility. What I would say is you go forward with a non-recurring operating request at whatever level. You don't have to tax to that value. The board can't, if revenues from the state come in stronger than we anticipate, awesome. And the board can under levy if you so desire. Or you can levy to the max, utilize that full revenue limit authority, and then help contribute to a surplus and use those funds to help replenish fund balance. So will be an interesting next 7 months, trust me.
And also, Mr. Hanks, I did ask Mr. Chady and Dr. Garrison to bring this to the board tonight. Originally, tonight was just going to be a single agenda item, but I wanted for all of us to be on the same page and looking. This is, it is very preliminary, just rough estimate, but it starts us to help understand where is that baseline from which we need to work from. So that's why we're looking at this tonight. So your patience is appreciated. Your patience in advance is appreciated.
Yeah, and again, we're throwing a dart at the dartboard. We hit the dartboard, but we're far from the target. We're far from a bullseye. I've got some stuff written down here. The business office needs to confirm our pupil count data that's in the model because we did identify one aberration that we know is incorrect. So we need to go back through and make sure that the data that's inputted is all accurate. We need to confirm that our revenues and expenses equal our 24-25 budget. Quick view appears to me that we're okay there. Need to look at our Fund 73 transfer to Fund 10. We have that in place for 24-25 as a balanced budget tool or technique, but that's likely not to be there or an option for us in 25-26 and thereafter as well. And the last comment I'll make is I do have a virtual meeting with Baird representatives on Wednesday, along with Stephanie Elwood and Brooke Walker and perhaps others from the district as well, just to kind of review the model and begin some additional work in the model. So,
go ahead.
I just want to, not a rebuttal, just a comment back. I am not questioning the integrity of Baird or these models going forward. It's just my comment on it. I would like to see, and I think it's pretty quick, to look the reality of the 23-24 budget and what actually happened and compare that to what was the ask and looking forward to the 24-25. So they wanted, I think the projection, and correct me if I'm wrong, go back to the 12, 11, and the 9. We went for the 9. Well, let's compare those numbers to what we actually spent and see. I just think there's a disparity on projections of what actually happened. And yes, the referendum failed, so trimmings had to happen, as we all know. I just want to make sure that the numbers we are using going forward, and I do agree. I mean, you look at this from last year. The ask was at the lowest $9 million. Now it's down into the, $5 million range. I mean, great work was done, and yes, we did cut a lot. And I agree with adding in the operation. If we do go to referendum for building maintenance to add them in together, I think they're more realistic looks. I question. Somebody else looking at saying, okay, well, it's this, so we'll just add 3% and keep going forward. I know it's a simplistic answer. Mm-hmm. But I just want to say that, projections are projections, and reality is reality, and what we actually did spend and our budget ended up was nothing like what Baird thought it would be for this year that we're in right now, because we had to make adjustments. So, and those are reflected into the projections going forward, I'm sure. But last year at this time, it was unheard of to think that we could make the budget happen at those numbers. And I am not disrespecting you or Baird or anybody. I'm just my little interpretation of looking at projections and budgets in reality speak. Because we do have control over the amount of money how we spend it. We really don't have too much control over how much money we get, except for referendum speak. And I'll just leave it at that. And I know we're very, very preliminary. I go into a lot of this now that I'm on the board with skepticism a little bit. And I know we'll do what is prudent and right for the district to forward the goals that we're all striving for. And thank you, Mr. Chady, for all your work and effort.
Mr. Hankins, thank you so much for that. Those numbers that went out on the survey last year, those estimates that you were talking about, that's why we're looking at this tonight, so that we can have a more, start thinking about what that projection that we want as board members to be asking for, perhaps a range that we think is better. And if you don't mind, if perhaps you could set up a meeting with Mr. Chady, and he can talk to you where we came up with those numbers, and because I know some of the other board members have questions too.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Miller?
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, just checking. All right, first of all, thank you so much, Mr. Chady and Dr. Garrison, for putting this together. It's so helpful to have some sort of picture to project where we might land and what factors we might look at. So since this is just a first look preliminary kind of overview, and I assume we're going to want to, we'll be bringing this back with greater detail. I just wanted to throw, I'm just going to pull up my notes here, throw out a couple of points that I would love to see if we could include back. So I like your logic about the 22.9 million over 4 years, and kind of like how that would shake out to about a $6 million operational per year if we did a 4-year non-recurring. I think that we need to sort of shoot a little higher than that. And what I'm wondering about are two factors. So one, you mentioned earlier about our goals, and one of our goals is retention. I don't know the last time, and I'm not expecting you to know offhand, but for when we bring this back, if we could take into consideration the last time staff at the district received like real CPI and factor in not just CPI for next year, but maybe a little above and beyond, because every time we pass a budget without making that allowance, that cost of living adjustment, then we're essentially giving out pay cuts, which is pretty demoralizing. So that's one thing I would like to see reflected in sort of our next draft. Another thing that I think is important to consider, also in line with the goals that we've sort of set forth, are I would love it just like how we do for each building, where we say, okay, principals, everybody's got to cut like 10%, right? Because we have to do our share. I would love to hear the opposite happen. I would love it if in between now and the next time we see numbers like this, there could be communication to each of our building principals to say like, hey, so like, let's assume the state gives us nothing, because that has happened before. What would you need per, like in your building, to meet all of the academic and behavioral needs optimally for your kids? So that could look at additional funding for like behavior specialist positions and additional para educators, both general education and special education. It might be, like a facilities adjustment to make sure there are spaces for children. It might be more interventionists. Like, I don't know, because I'm not a building principal in the school district of Beloit. But I think it would be really helpful, not just for me as a board member, but also for our community, who has asked repeatedly for like more of a line item breakdown about how these dollars will be spent. Not to then say to commit like, oh yeah, like Miss Pels needs $6,000 for these types, or whatever, but just to say that what we've received back from each of our buildings looks like this. This is how these budget asks align to academic and behavioral needs, right? And then in addition, just kind of going back to my previous point, we could then say like, this is how like this pocket of money or whatever the amount ends up being would then contribute to staff retention, right? To make up for past, I guess, lack of CPI. So like, I'm just hoping, I guess in summary, I think this is fabulous. This is like such a good start. I think for the next step, I think it would be good to see what dollars realistically, like from people who are working with kids in our district right now, like what does Beloit Memorial High School need to meet their current and anticipated academic and behavioral, needs. I'm saying needs too many times, sorry, like for their kids, right? Like what does Converse need? What does Merrill need, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's how we should build out our ask, so that when we do go to the community, we're like, yep, this is exactly what these dollars are going to. So there's like much less ambiguity and confusion.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Brian Anderson.
Thank you, but I think with respect, Ms. Levy was far ahead of me with her hand up. So please, Ms. Levy, if I could yield to you, that I'll jump in right after you. How about that?
if that's okay with Board President Johnson.
That's fine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So just a few things. One, to Board Member Hankins' point, it's my understanding, and someone, if I have this wrong, please do correct me, but the previous referendum scenarios were not based on what was needed to fully fund the district. It was based on what was believed the community would support. So I think that's where the disconnect is coming with those three options and then what we actually spent. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and hopefully that brings some clarity to those numbers versus what actually happened with our spending. One, thank you for the presentation, Mr. Chady. I'm very encouraged to hear that a potential 4-year non-reoccurring referendum is a possibility. I also, hand in hand with that, think it's so important to track student achievement if the referendum passes, to connect that achievement back to the funding received from this referendum. Just a couple points. It's my understanding that we are going to have an upcoming community meeting so that staff and board members and community members can give their input or weigh in with respect to visioning for the district. So one, let me just pause. Is that a thing that we foresee happening in the near future?
Yes, that is correct.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And what I wanted to be clear about that is that I hope that the intent is to take that visioning and attach dollar amounts to it so that we can then prioritize. Okay, this is what we are collectively saying that we want for our district. And this is the amount, and of course, these are estimates that will count, that will cost when we are building out what our ask will be. And I would love to see student achievement prioritized, employee compensation and retention, also our capital needs. But I also want us to look at what items have been cut in order to keep us afloat. And of those items that have been cut, what is really important for student achievement, that those items be restored. And I think if we pull from those different places with dollar amounts attached, then we can prioritize and really build out and ask. I don't want to ask for just enough to get by. I want to ask for the amount that is going to allow us to grow and to thrive as a district. So I think those are all of my points for now, and thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, thank you. I want to echo the thank yous to Dr. Garrison, Mr. Chady, and your team. Putting together a budget for a 2, 3, 4, 5-year window on, hey, what might happen is a very, very tough ask. And I know we'll take that information as what I call the best that we know right now. And it's going to change, but it's the best that we know right now. So I just want to categorize it as that, and thank you for putting it together. I think what this tells me is, without a referendum, we are literally out of funds in the 27-28 budget, right? And so the last 2 years when we went to referendum and I had my chance to have a say, I said, well, look, we need a 1-year budget because we need to prove it out. We need to cut where we need to cut, and those are the things we need to do. And we've done that. And I think, I know not that it's only her idea, but Board Member Levy's idea of this 4-year plan, I think, is where it was kind of brought into my line of thinking. And, my fear is we pass a 1-year referendum and we say, hey, we're going to bring on additional staff. We're going to bring on programming. We're going to bring on all these things to match our student achievement goals. And then when it doesn't pass the next year, you cut it off at the knees. And one, we don't have data to show if it worked because it's too short a time period. And we kind of start this cycle of kind of failure by inaction because we don't have the funds to move forward. So I think a 4-year plan that's well thought out it offers stability. And to some of the community members that say, hey, referendums cost money just to run, right? We've heard some comments. I get it. It does. We run a 4-year referendum on a per year basis. You can cut that by 4. referendums cost less on a per year basis that way. So it's another way to attack the true cost of putting the referendum together and divide that over many years, in the same way that capital referendums do for some of these brick and mortar repairs that we need to do. I think, a failure to do it, what that tells me is this is just to get us through, to keep the doors open. And I think a couple of the board members spoke to that tonight. I think asking the questions of what's going to affect student achievement is a 100% valid question, and to get to that right number, other than just keep the lights on. There's two different approaches. We tried to keep the lights on the last 2 years, and now administration has put some work in, right? And we've made some tough decisions, and I think it's time to say, okay, what do the next 4 years look like? And so anyway, with what we know now and the numbers we know now, and they're going to change, and they may go up, they may go down, but I think the mindset of continuous improvement is where we need to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Nichols, did you have anything you'd like to ask or say?
Well, I don't really have a whole lot to add because my former board members board members before me have done a great job of describing some things that I think we need to look at, and I would echo that. And I like tying everything to academic achievement and how the funding helped and how I think that's a great concept to look at too. And I like the 4-year plan. I think that's when that came up last week. I think that's a good number to look at. I think sometimes we really have to think outside the box because we get hung up on a year, a certain number of years, and nothing's off the table. So I think and I know we're going to have to kind of zero in a little bit more on the FTEs, Mr. Chady. I agree. This is a great presentation. It helps a lot, as I said, comment before the meeting started. So we probably know that the FTEs are going to drop a little bit, and how that's going to affect our revenues. So I think just continue to move forward one day at a time, and then see where we are.
Thank you, Vice President Nichols. Mr. Chady, I did have one question myself. Is the 8% the normal amount you would typically estimate for at this time in your budget for the healthcare?
In prior districts and what my colleagues in the past have traditionally utilized, that would be the norm. Though I would say the last couple of years, I think health insurance percentage increases in premiums has gone up more than that. When it does go up more than that, then that causes the district to look at, are there plan design changes that we can make to, perhaps implement a higher copay or something, which then in turn drops the monthly premium and drops that percentage increase. But yeah, I'm comfortable using that today. It gets us in the ballpark. We're probably far from the bullseye, but we're at the right game at least.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you so much, Mr. Chady. Our next item tonight is the referendum budget discussions.
And so, sorry.
And this is to hear an overview of what the costs were of the previous referenda efforts. Dr. Garrison?
Yes, ma'am. So 2 things. One, we were able to kind of look back at some historical data as it pertains to our 2 referendums, and just a slight overview of these two conversations. In 2023, we had an operational and a capital conversation that was on the table, but we also had a shorter amount of time to to kind of work through those conversations, and we were in the ballpark of about $80,000. Please note that again, that was a two operational and capital conversation, and we were in the ballpark about $80,000. Our window of time again was a little bit shorter due to when we were able to kick things off with that first referendum. The second conversation, well, last year, just this year, of course, we were at a ballpark number of a little over $113,000. Of course, I'm rounding up, and that was just for the operational conversation. Please note that we also, since we had more time, we actually were in the game a little earlier, and of course, we did more surveys to the community. We did more advertising as such throughout the operational campaign. And so, to Mrs. Levy's conversation, hopefully, this gave everyone a snapshot as it pertains to kind of where we were with our two conversations. Hopefully, we will be able to nail down a future conversation in our next agenda item. However, this is something that the board did ask me to go back and kind of look at, and we kind of put this together as a snapshot for you all for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Mr. Chady, did you want to add anything before I open it up for questions? No. Okay, wonderful. Ms. Levy?
Thank you. Two quick questions. The first referendum, if you could give me a ballpark of how long that campaign was, and then how much was the cost outside of personnel, so printing or any other cost that is not the staff, what portion of that 80,000? And then the same question for the second campaign. And the reason I'm asking is, one, we have bids in front of us, and I want to know, and again, it's an estimate and things cost more, et cetera, but how much are we adding to those quotes that they gave us for a realistic cost? And then two, how long each campaign was, so we know how long we need potentially the services of whomever we select.
Sure. The first campaign, the first one in 2023, we started pretty much around February, and a lot of the things that were done in that conversation were again in-house because we had both Marco Christopa and Maria Acevedo working really side by side on both the literature and then of course the overall advertising and development of things were done in-house. So we started pretty much in February. I'm a little confused about the cost for people, Mrs. Levy. Can you?
No, absolutely. My apologies for not being clear. I don't want to know the cost for people, because they gave us a quote and that's for their services. But what none of them include, which makes sense, is like printing, any video recording if we want to do spots. So my question is, of that $80,000, can you give me and I get we did it in-house, but a ballpark of what was the non-personnel cost? So printing, postage, all of what went into it. What was the non-personnel cost out of the 80,000?
I would have to say 80,000. I mean, because when you look at whether it's printing from Bosley, or I'm just giving you an example for whether it's printing, whether it's, let's say the first referendum, whether it was printing, whether it was videos, these are all things that are done by someone else and with a cost. Yeah, so that'll be my humble opinion. Mrs.
Yeah, I would concur to what Dr. Garrison just mentioned there. So with regards to the timeline for both 23 and 24 referendums, they both kind of, I mean, it's all the same, right? Mid-January through the first Tuesday in April. So your time frame's about the same, will be again next year. And then all of the costs that are attributed here are non-personnel costs. So these are costs with regards to outside vendors that contributed to or helped us print communication pieces or produce photography or video or radio advertising, et cetera.
Perfect. So in summary, we're looking at about a 3-month campaign, and anywhere from an additional, above what has been quoted, $80,000 to $115,000 more. Is that accurate?
It could be, and let me just say could, because the board could also say we want to go work with, let's just say X company, not to exceed X amount. So, and I say it could be, Mrs. Lee, that's the board could give us, the authority to go to $100,000 or to stop at, let's say $90,000. In that case, that changes our packages with our said uh, with our said what's the word I'm looking for? Potential partner, and we will have to go from there.
Got it. And just my final thought, which I don't expect you to have I'm wondering if we cap it, if someone may pull out.
No,
But we
no,
can't.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah. I don't think they'll pull out. What I think it is, we'll have to look at what we want to bring to the table. Maybe it's not radio ads, to give you an example. Maybe it's not more literature sent out to the families. Maybe it's not so many postcards that we print off. I mean, those are the other side of the conversation that we have to look at. In a lot of districts, too, when there is a possible organizations that want to support, some of this will also possibly offset the cost. And again, although I can't count on that necessarily, sometimes those other organizations that may want to support the conversation and working with your school district, these other organizations step up in kind donations for X themes. And so that's a possibility. Of course, I can't bank on that, but I do want to make sure that that you and of course the public knows that sometimes other organizations step in and do in-kind donations for the support of said referendum.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Any other board member questions? Mr. Hankins?
Thank you. Just going back, the last two failed referendums, and we did have contracted services. I'm just wondering, did they offer or have a follow-up? I mean, we as a board, I know, took it upon ourselves to have these listening sessions with the people who voted no and why. But did the contracted services offer to do a wraparound and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, so we don't make the same mistake twice, i.e., you just talked about radio advertising or print. What worked, what didn't? Is there a way that they tracked what was good money spent and what didn't? Was it the message or was it the method? And I'm just wondering if they gave you any insight after everything was said and done, which I think is the most important thing that we should learn from failed referendums is why they didn't go, not just our opinions on what we think went wrong. Just wondering if they offer that service back. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Hankins, for your question. Unfortunately, we didn't necessarily work with a company on both of our referendums. One due to, of course, cost and the state of our organization as we try to, work through our organizational needs. So we didn't work with a company. What we did do in the first year was we did work as a consultant. They gave us information, not necessarily doing the things that they would typically do in a referendum. And so that was the space that we worked from. So we didn't have a company working with us. We had pretty much ourselves trying to get this done, which is not, I shouldn't say it's not atypical because it does happen in many districts across everyone that has to go to referendum. But in this case, we are asking for, or the administration is asking for, a company to come in and specifically help us with our referendum efforts 2025.
Thank you.
Any other board questions? Thank you, Dr. Garrison and Mr. Chady. The next item is referendum communications.
Yes, Mrs. Johnson, can I start?
Sure thing. The purpose of this is to review information from communications and marketing companies to assist with the communications for the 2025 spring referendum. Dr. Garrison?
Thank you. So the board did ask me to go back and look at 3 different opportunities for quotes. I will say that I was able to solidify with assistance these three quotes, one from CISA 10, one from the Donovan Group, and most recently shared with the board was the Halsey Group that did come through right here at the end. And so I wanted to make sure that the board did have these as options. Another one of the companies that I did reach out to, unfortunately, had to back out, and due to timing of our referendum, and of course other referendum needs that they may have to take a look at in their own stack of referendums that are coming up in 2025. I do believe all three quotes give us a snapshot of around what services will be provided. Most importantly for me, as a district administrator in this conversation, will be those opportunities for community conversations and that assistance. Um, I will say we are definitely not meeting short in the district, especially when we're doing the referendum conversations. We do as many as we possibly need to get this across the finish line. But we also want to do the right conversations as well. And so I do believe that each of the three could give us that snapshot. I will stand corrected that CISA 10 does have an office in Madison after speaking with them a little bit more in detail over this past week. CISA 10 does have an office in Madison. I want to just bring note to that. Most recently, the one that the Donovan Group, of course, they have offices in Madison, Milwaukee. You all have the presentations, snapshots of that. And then Halsey is actually came on to the table here most recently, and they are actually located right out of Milton. Just to give just a few, another quick snapshot, the Donovan Group did work in Janesville as well as the Halsey Group. The reason why I'm sharing that is because the Donovan Group was a part of the Janesville's conversation and also Halsey, so they actually had dual companies working with them to see that referendum conversation forward. That their capacities were different and working with that community, but I definitely wanted to make sure that the board had that information as well because I didn't want to leave it out of the conversation. Just trying to give a snapshot of all three. Again, CISA 10 is located primarily out of northern Wisconsin. However, again, they do have a office here in Madison, and that is just an overall snapshot. I'll take any questions that I can that I'll be able to answer in this conversation, and we'll go from there. Board President Johnson.
Thank you. Are there any board members that have questions? Ms. Levy?
Thank you. Quick question. So for Donovan, it looks like in their proposal that they are $8,000 a month. For CISA 10, I see the operational projection at 13,200, and if we do operational and capital, 18,900. And it's going to be the same question for Hadley. What time frame is that work done over, since it's not a monthly billing?
So when you say time frame, are you referring to like separate or like when will we pay them?
No. What is the duration that they will do their work? So for example, the Donovan Group has a timeline, which I'm sure we can adjust it to fit our needs in what activities happen in which month. But they also provide their monthly billing is $8,000 a month. So if we
Sure.
decided to start working with them in January or February, we have an idea of how much that would cost. So for example, CISA 10 gave us two different quotes. The first for operational, which is 13,200, and the second for operational plus capital, 18,900. But does that mean they start working, if selected, in December and work through April? Is that February through April? Like what time frame aligns with that quoted amount? And then the same question for the Hadley. Let me make sure I get it right. Hadley Social and Public Relations.
Great questions. And so typically with both the organizations that did not provide those quotes, those are negotiable opportunities that I would venture into. Determined based off of who we choose today, we will, with those two groups, I can sit down and say, okay, now that we've move forward with whomever, let's look at our overall, how the payment schedules will look. Naturally, December is a time frame in which they will probably start doing some work, so I know there'll be December charges. But since that's their overall, that's since that is their overall number, let's just say 6 to 10 to 13,000 for just, let's say we just use operational, then typically they would want to get paid all the way through April. It wouldn't be all upfront right away because again, there's a different meetings that we will have and different conversations that we'll have. There'll be different times and point checks where we would want to send certain things out. And so typically, again, it's the 70 plus days after the January 21st date, and when the real a lot of the real conversations start to have as pertains to getting into the public and laying out our operational, capital, and or hybrid conversation. So again, Ms. Levy, typically those two organizations will probably push that out all the way through April, those payments.
And I'm not so much concerned with when payments need to be made, but I'm a little skeptical that let's just say we just do operational, just to keep it simple. That CISA is going to charge us $13,200 to work between now and April. And Hadley might charge us $35,000 to work between now and April. Are you clear that that's the understanding, or are we making some assumptions here?
I'm clear that that's the understanding. Again, most of the work will happen over time, and so we would have to pay them overtime. Same way the Donovan Group laid out their $8,000 a month roughly, we would have to pay them overtime.
Any
Okay,
other questions?
I'm so sorry. I'm gonna try this one last time. So if we're using Donovan as a base, and that's $8,000 a month, so if we compare that to CISA 10, and they're asking for an operational referendum, if you are clear that that 13,200 is for work between now and April, that is a huge difference in 8,000 a month. That's like 3,000 a month versus 8,000 a month. So that's why I wanted to make sure, but it sounds like you're pretty certain that that's what that quote means. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Brian Nichols?
Thank you. Oh, shoot, I lost hang on a second. Dang it. Hate it when this happens. There we go. I'm trying to turn it off. So, Dr. Garrison, a couple of questions. The CISA 10 proposal looks to be a little thin. I'm not sure that's the right way to describe it, but it seems a little thinner than the other two proposals. But he did propose costs for both an operational and a capital, as did Hadley. They both had costs for one or both. Donovan did not. They did not even refer to capital referendum. So, is that not anywhere in their proposal? So, does that mean wasn't included? It's not included. Is my estimation by not seeing any reference to it.
Great question. I would have to double back and ask Donovan that specific question, but I will say that when it comes to marketing material and putting together the information, operational oftentimes has some direct things already in place. Capital has some direct things already in place. For instance, we have our facility study already. So what we'll be asking for will be X versus, possibly having to project what we will need from operational perspective. Again, I can definitely ask that specific question, but I do believe you are correct that what you see in front of you is for the operational space. Um, but I can go back and ask that question specifically.
Okay, thank you. Then one other question. The most recent, the one we got today, Hadley. Did they also worked with Milton for the Milton referendum, correct? That also was successful.
Yes, you are correct.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Garrison.
No problem.
And any other questions from board members? No other questions. I would entertain a motion at this time. If there is a preferred contracting or a communications or marketing company of these three bids that Dr. Garrison has brought to us, if anyone wishes to move forward, I'm opening the floor for potential motions. Ms. Levy?
Thank you. Quick question. Are we all in agreement that we are interested in going to referendum in April of 2025? Because I don't believe we've publicly and officially addressed that. And I think that would be appropriate before we determine a firm to use for that endeavor. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page.
That is an excellent question. Mr. Hankins?
I wholeheartedly agree with you, Mrs. Levy. It was that we gave the consensus to gain information on going forward, and it was brought to us, and we gave approval to nod ahead. This is a definite stroke. I really think Mr. Nichols' question about the Donovan Group, without even knowing if that includes both referendums, and we haven't even talked at the board level about two or one, or even if we're going. So I totally agree with you, Mrs. Levy, that we're precipitating something that may not happen. I don't think we need to jump yet. I know time is of the essence, but this board needs to discuss if we are actually going to referendum. You're right. We haven't decided that. We gave a nod of approval to seek information, and to me, that's what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hankins.
Mrs. Johnson, do you mind? I'm sorry.
Oh, Brian Nichols was next.
Yes, Board Member Levy, Board Member Hankins, I agree 100%. I think we're premature to try to agree or disagree on who we're going to work with because we don't have enough information. And maybe as Board Member Levy alluded to, we may need to spend this time deciding if we're going to go and when we're going to go and all that sort of thing. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Dr. Garrison?
Yes, this is the double back on the Donovan Group. I was able to solidify that the quote is the same for both operational and capital for a Donovan Group, Mrs. Levy, just to let you know that, and the whole board know that as well. So their quote is for operational capital total. Secondly, I know the board hasn't necessarily stated that we want to move forward with operational referendum. What gives me a little pause in this conversation is that our need is still the same. We have a deficit going into the next school year, and no one is putting pressure in that space because that's what it is. What we need to put pressure on is our board coming together and saying, this is what we need for our community. I do believe that we've presented information across the board for the past 2 years, given a real clear-cut conversation around our operational needs for our school district and some of our capital needs for our school district. And at this time, I do believe we have given enough information to say we are in this space to, of course, move forward. Now, that's the request from the administration. I know it's real tough being a board member because you also have to look at maybe some other extenuating factors that one has to deal with being a community leader. But from a district perspective, we've laid out for the past 3 years our deficit year over year, and we've also had to lay out a very tight windows of cuts beyond cuts beyond cuts, beyond reductions to kind of put us right back in the situation that we're in right now, where Mr. Chady did just present even a snapshot of our budget gives us a deficit for coming into the next year. And so that's just my space in that space. I do believe that the administration has presented a lot of information the board has seen over the past 2 and/or 3 years now, as it pertains to our budgetary needs. And I would like to thank the administration and, of course, my team for, of course, putting all this information together. But I do believe we have put um, enough information in front of the board to make a reasonable decision around going to referendum. And again, Mrs. Levy, that $40,000 that's quoted by the Donovan Group, not to be exact in the number, is for both operational and capital, if we decide to go in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. And just for clarification, so if any one of these agencies that we have a bid from, if the board decides to go to have both an operational and a capital, say we went with Donovan, then the total charge would be $80,000?
No, for the Donovan, their total charge is whether operational capital is 40,000 plus whatever we end up spending in our printing, let's just say advertising and materials. For That's just for the Donovan group. For the other two groups, it'll be the same conversation, whatever their balance is, 13,000. Let's just use 6 to 10, 13, and I believe it was 18 for the operational capital, 33 all in for them, plus whatever it will be for our materials, printing, and other said items. Same thing for the Hosley group. Uh, their cost to help us through the referendum, plus whatever we end up spending in that space as pertains to print materials and other information.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Sorry, thank you so much. Sorry, I had to turn my camera off because my internet was going in and out. I apologize. Okay, so I just went back and looked at our last meeting, and it looks like there was a motion that passed for 6-1 to move the April referendum conversation forward. And I think the purpose that we took that vote was not because, like, to board member Levy's point, which I think is very important that we kind of keep that in the focus. We don't have exact numbers yet because we still are doing the work, but I thought that there was at least majority consensus that we are intending to go to referendum. So, like, I understand the concern. I think the reason that we're being asked to take action this evening to move forward with a group is because if we don't do that now, we're putting ourselves at a liability of, like, if we wait to approve this in early January, which is when it'll have to happen because most of us will be at the WASB convention, I think, at the deadline. When, like, that's like, cool, we're going to get started maybe too little too late if there's even a group available. And I think that Dr. Garrison sort of shared all that last time, that, like, we haven't really worked with anybody officially before outside of consulting because, like, there just hasn't been the opportunity to arrange that with a group. And so I think that the administration, like, we've asked the administration to give us, like, this budget snapshot tonight and to continue working through these numbers. I personally just asked for a number of things to come back in the next one. We're making a lot of asks of our administration, and I think they're asking us, in order for them to do these things, for us to give them some, an agency to work with to help move this forward, which is what we voted 6-1 to do last week. So I don't have I'm going to go with the will of the board. I think this has been a great discussion in terms of where we, which company we go with, but I think we need to take action tonight. So if we decide in January not to go for some reason, then I guess my only request then would be, Dr. Garrison, if you could just ensure that there's some sort of contract language that protects us from paying for a service that we're not going to use. Otherwise, I have no problem going forward tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, so I think good points by Board Member Miller. I think we're far enough down the road that we need to give administration enough authority to move forward. Assuming we've got more proposals tonight than we had last time, and there's not a specific recommendation made in the agenda, but assuming that the Donovan Group is. I guess whichever one is going to be the actual recommendation by the administration, I would support that to move this forward. I don't think we have time to ask for more information. I mean, we know how budgets are made. They've given us as much information, I think, as we're going to get. I think this group can help us drive the next step, in my opinion, is going to be, what does the question say? How much? How many years? What's going to pass? And that's what we're paying for. From this group, along with the marketing and outreach. But in my opinion, I think we've got to move this forward this evening, and not kick the can down the road any further with 55 days left and 3 holidays in between there. So I'm ready to move forward. I'd like to hear one more time from administration on which group is actually their recommendation based on processing this information a little bit more than we have. I don't see an issue with any of them, but I would lean into the administration's recommendation on them.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Chady?
Just a couple of quick comments. I know that the board's thinking a lot about the capital referendum question and costs. I can't speak for the board. It's your decision what you want to do, but I really don't see the School District of Beloit being ready to put forward a capital referendum question, a separate capital referendum question. So maybe that point is a bit mute. Working with our partners at Epstein Ewan Architects, EUA, and Findorf and Facilities, and Tommy Bricko, our Director of Facilities, we're kind of targeting a prioritized need capital referendum of phase 1 for November of 26, looking that far ahead, because we think it'll take that much time to help identify what the priority needs are over the next few years, and then what the community is willing to support. So thinking about April of 25, there are capital improvement needs that we need to address. The question is, do we do that through a separate operating referendum question, or do we build that all into one operating referendum question to address the capital needs in summer of 25 and perhaps the summer of 26? So a separate capital improvement or a debt issuance referendum, I don't think is going to happen, or we're not ready for at this point in time. With regards to the communications firms, I understand where the board's at and the thought process, about do we go forward, don't go forward, et cetera. Seems to me that the board's trying to line up a community workshop, board workshop on the referendum for Saturday, December 7th, 6th, whatever that date is, 7th, thank you. I know it was in that ballpark. If the board's going to select one of these communication firms, and if their schedule permits, it might very well be very wise for them to attend that workshop as well. But in order for them to commit to doing that, you have to have a contract commitment with them to perform some services and some associated costs. So they're not going to show up voluntarily with hopes that they get the job, but something to think about there as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chady. Mr. Nichols? Okay, Ms. Levy?
Thank you. So here are my 2 cents. If we look closely at one, I'm in support of going to referendum in April. I just wanted us to do things decent and in order and make sure we're not putting the cart before the horse. If we look at the submission from Donovan, they are the only proposal that's on a per month basis. So it's $8,000 flat fee per month. Ideally, I would like to sync up a contract. So my preference is to use them. I would like to sync up a contract where we have 3 months of work. So if we backdate the contract from the spring election back 3 months, that's going to put us in January. Ideally, it may be beneficial for them to attend that December 7th meeting, but I don't foresee them with what we have together right now because we're not ready to message to the community yet. I don't see the wisdom in incurring an $8,000 bill just so they can attend that meeting. I foresee the bulk of the work starting in the new year once we have more information to direct that work. So again, my preference is Donovan. That's what I'll be supporting. Not that that needs to influence what anyone else is doing. I want to be clear. And also my preference is to schedule the contract so it's a 3-month window of work. So that would put us at $24,000, and then we can negotiate what things happen within that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nichols?
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Garrison, I'm going to go back to you again because I think we need to get a clarification. For some reason, I think I understand what you're saying, Board Member Levy, $8,000 a month, but I think they just divided their total by 5 months. That's my take. I'm not sure that that's a fact, but Dr. Garrison, I think we need a clarification again from Donovan Group. Are they going to charge us $40,000 whether it's 3 months or 5 months or 4 months? And that's critical to know because if it's going to be 40, well then Hadley's going to do it for 34,000 and change. 34,899. They may or may not be willing to bill monthly. I don't know. I don't even know who they are. However, I think we need clarification if you can get that tonight.
Mr. Hankins?
Just from a step-by-step process, I would feel more comfortable if we had a motion to the board goes on record on saying we are going ahead with a referendum. I think we owe that to the public. It's not on our agenda for a vote on that because we haven't done it yet. We said we'd look at it. And I agree wholeheartedly with all this conversation, but to me, if I'm an audience member and or public, I'm going, wait a minute, you guys didn't even vote on having a referendum yet, and now we're committing to spending money on said referendum. So I think it would do us well to, if it's not on the agenda, so I don't know a little parliamentary procedure, that at least we could put it on Tuesday's agenda, and maybe we could, after that, vote is taken, and then recommend, since we've had this great discussion about who, and we could do both. If it doesn't, it's a moot point. If it doesn't pass it, the board is not in favor of going ahead with the referendum, which I'm not sure. I'm not speaking for anybody, but I just think we have to do one first. I think it's only proper. The public needs to know, and they can have their input at the public comments next Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hankins. Ms. Levy?
Just to provide clarification for Board Member Nichols's point, if you read the proposal for Donovan, it says the total cost of the project is $40,000 if the project runs from December through April. And then it goes on to say that it'll bill the district at the end of each month for $8,000. So I believe that's where they came up with the 40, assuming that we would work with them from December to April and their charge is $8,000 a month, or at least that's what they communicated in the quote.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Any other board questions or comments? Dr. Garrison, it sounds like there's some questions that board members have that might be difficult to get answers to tonight. And I understand what Mr. Hankins is saying about maybe we should procedurally do a board vote on the referendum first. Would it be possible for you to get those questions answered? And since we have a board meeting a week from tonight, put this on next regular board meeting agenda.
At the will of the board, I can, of course, put this on the agenda for next week. I will say that right now I only have one question, which is from Mrs. Levy based off of the monthly charges. I think we have to remember that although we're talking about what we believe they could do during this time, there's a lot of conversations that the administration and the communications opportunity happens throughout this conversation. So we start building our platform as soon as we jump in the boat with our provider. And so I understand that there's conversations that we need to have internally still, which is natural. Like Mr. Chady had already mentioned, we do have a December 7th conversation coming up. I would want them at the conversation, which still could happen based off of a conversation on December 3rd. But I don't understand what else is the delay outside of making a decision to go towards referendum. Um, Board President Johnson, thank you so much for allowing this conversation to happen. But I do believe we've again presented enough information for our board to make a reasonable decision around moving forward with a referendum conversation um, um, for the 2025 school year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Ms. Miller?
Thank you. So I guess like Mr. Hankins, I appreciate what you're saying, and I agree that the public needs to be clear on what we're planning on doing. I think that was the reason we voted last week, and I believe you made the motion and I seconded to move forward with planning for the referendum. So while I understand the concern, and I'm more than happy to, if you feel comfortable, Mr. Hankins, with restating language on maybe next week's agenda, like happy to do so. I think the reason we're meeting this evening is because Dr. Garrison made it clear that we need to move on this sooner rather than later. So I would really appreciate, I mean, I'm ready to make a motion to go, for one of these groups this evening so that we can kind of get the ball rolling in order to hopefully successfully go to referendum.
Mr. Hankins?
I agree with you, Megan. I just, to make this second, we've heard this before in the past at several different times, that if it's not stated on the agenda, then the public doesn't have a chance to input. So that's my only drawback. I'm ready to take a vote on it, but I think we're circumventing the public. And I'm thinking if they have advance notice today that we are going to be discussing whether we're actually going for a referendum. And I think also there's some ambiguity, or even in my mind, and Mr. Chady, we alluded to a week ago and 2 weeks ago about two separate referendums or one referendum. I think that needs to be clarified. And I know that's what I heard tonight from Mr. Chady, and I'm not sure I heard correctly, but we heard before about, I want to know the pros and cons of asking for both or two or one, or not just, or just an operational one and not building one. So to me, there's several questions involved in that, and I don't think they're real difficult to answer, but I think the public and the board, myself included, need to have knowledge on the pros and cons of asking for both together or separate. And I think Mr. Chady kind of alluded to that. Maybe we're not ready for a building one. And if that's the will, that's fine. Then I think the vote next Tuesday would be whether the board supports going to referendum on operations. But that's just the questions. I just don't want to go ahead and sign a contract going without even having the public input on the referendum. But I do appreciate what you're saying. And yes, I'm ready to make a vote, but I don't think that's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hankins. Dr. Garrison?
Yeah, great conversation from the board, and that's what I appreciate, about our board, is that we are, we want to be as thorough as possible. Regardless if we go to operational and or capital, we're going to need an organization to support us. And so again, regardless if we go operational or capital, we're going to need an organization to support us. And with that being stated, I do know that as pertains to billing and billing cycles, when working with any organization as such, we can spread this out as well. We can do, I know the contract states what you see here as a quote um, is 8,000, let's just say for Donovan per month. We can ask for that to be spread out over 10 months, you know. And so those are conversations that I have on my side of the table as a district administrator. We just need to go ahead to work with an organization. Again, regardless if we decide to go operational and or capital, um, we will need an organization to work with us as we move this conversation forward. And so that is the reason why the administration does believe tonight we should be moving forward, because after tonight, let's say a decision is made in this space, I call them today, we get off the phone and start having conversations right. We got the call right after this. And so Wednesday is is the start of December for us. It's just that space that the administration has to work from in these very detailed operational and or capital referenda for the public, especially when you're looking at the marketing pieces. And so I just want to make sure that that's noted. Regardless of when we go or what we decide, we will need an organization to work with. And this green light gives me that opportunity to start working with them. If we don't, guess what? I don't have to pay nobody because no work has happened. If the board decides to go in a different direction on upcoming Tuesday, if the vote is taken at that point to go to referendum.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Mr. Nichols?
Okay. Well, let's see where we go with this. I'm going to make a motion that we select Hadley Social and Public Relations to be our referendum contractor, with a couple of stipulations that they would be willing to bill us monthly for the time period that we use them, and also that if the board ultimately would come to the decision to not go to referendum, that we would be able to cancel the contract with no cost to us.
Ms. Shope, did you get that? Would you mind reading back what you've got?
Okay. I had to ad-lib just a hair on some things, so I'll tell you where. So move approval of contracting with Hadley, and I'll finish filling in their full name, for referendum planning for 2024-25, with stipulations that they are willing to bill us monthly, and should the board decide not to go to referendum, the district, instead of us, or we, could cancel the contract with no cost to the district instead of us. Is that what you were saying?
Excellent.
Okay.
There is a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion by Brian Nichols, seconded by Tom Hankins. For discussion, Ms. Levy?
Thank you. So just a couple points. One, is there a recommendation by the administration as to your preference with the quotes? And two, I don't support picking a firm before we have an official vote to go to referendum. So if that could be on Tuesdays, spoiler alert, I'm voting no. But also, is there a cap on how much we're going to spend? Because Hadley is on the table through this motion. Operational only is just under 35,000. for operational and capital, it's just under 42,000. And then those costs that could range from 80 to 113 are going to be added in unless we put a cap on what we would like to spend for this referendum. So just a couple items to keep in mind. And again, the first question was, is there a recommendation from the administration?
Yes, the recommendation from, I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson.
Oh, I was just going to say, I believe you mentioned earlier that the Donovan Group was your preferred company.
That is correct.
Ms. Miller?
Thank you. I was just wondering, do we have a sense from the administration, like if the terms laid out in the current motion are possible with the Hadley Group?
Yes, I had a wonderful conversation with the Hadley Group, and I do believe that we could make, the terms negotiable in that space. Again, these are quotes, and so I do believe that that's something that we could work out. Again, the main goal is to, of course, work with a company that we believe that can help us get across the finish line. Again, I had a wonderful conversation with the Hadley Group. Um, Nothing against their organization or anything like that. I do have a little bit more experience working with the Donovan Group, and of course, working with them when I say working with them, I do know of their work, and of course, some of the organizations that they've worked with, superintendents as well. So that was why my recommendation was the Donovan Group. Again, if the board moves forward with the Hadley Group, I would have to work with them. But again, my recommendation would be the Donovan Group. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I guess I would like to move this forward, but I'm struggling with moving forward with a group that our administration didn't recommend. So I don't know, I guess, but it is good to know that you believe, Dr. Garrison, that the terms laid out in the motion are possible. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Not a problem. And again, if the board, I think one of the hardest parts about our district is, again, some of the conversations that I have to have, and I know I've had conversations with both of these organizations, actually all three of these organizations. And at the current time, I just feel a little bit more comfortable with the Donovan Group. However, I'm not going to say I didn't have positive conversations with the Hadley Group. These are all
Dr.
about
Harrison,
relationships.
we're having a hard time hearing you. Dr. Garrison, are you still there?
I'm still here. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
That's a little bit better.
Sure. And so again, I have had conversations with all three of these organizations. I had a great conversation with the Hadley Group. And so I just want to make sure that's noted in this conversation. The reason why I'm moving forward with my recommendation being Donovan Group is because I do have a lot more time in with that group as it pertains to just knowledge about the Donovan Group and the work that they do for organizations. And so that's just where I'm at with my recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Mr. Nichols.
A couple of things that I guess I'm looking at maybe a little different than the rest of the group, but I guess I like it that they're located in Rock County and that they've worked and helped two districts just to our north successfully pass referendums in the last 30 days. So for me, that was kind of the and they seem to have a fair price on their quote too. So those are the things that I was focused on. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Hankins?
I totally agree with Mr. Nichols. When I read the three this afternoon, the Hadley Group jumped out. I love being local. They know more of our issues that are here. They don't have as high of a learning curve. But I do want to go back to what Mrs. Levy said, and I'm fully on board with her, that I would vote nay. But when Brian added on that pending board approval, I would strongly suggest that on the agenda for next week, that it is a motion to move ahead with a referendum, and specifically operation or capital and or both. And then we can go ahead full head steam, or we stop and figure it out again. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Ms. Shope, can we get a roll call vote on this, please?
Amy Levy,
Nay.
Brian Nichols,
Aye.
Brian Anderson,
Aye.
Tom Hankins,
Aye.
Megan Miller,
Aye.
and Tia Johnson.
Aye.
Motion carried 5-1.
Thank you. Our last agenda item tonight is the ad hoc committee. And the purpose of this discussion is for the board members to determine a specific and clear charge focused on the 2025-26 budget, but also include discussions around current needs and priorities of the district and the April referendum. Dr. Garrison and Mr. Chady?
Yeah, so we did have conversations. Thank you, board. We did have conversations in reference to having more conversations with the ad hoc committee. I was able to meet with the chair of the ad hoc committee, Mrs. Carol Fox, around some of the specifics around kind of what we're looking for moving forward from the team. I do believe there's a space for the ad hoc committee to continue to working with us in conversations around the budget. But additionally, there's conversations that we need to have as it pertains to them helping us with possible conversations as pertains to moving forward with an operational and a capital referendum and of some form of hybrid. And so with that being stated, again, I have had conversations with the team, and that is just a gist of kind of what we talked about. And I'll turn it back over to Mrs. Johnson for further discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. Do board members have any questions or comments? Oh, go ahead.
Just thinking this through, and I'm hoping that the ad hoc committee will sign on to help us through this next charge and the next budget crisis that we're going to have. My question is, procedurally, the direction came from the board and it went to the Budgetary Operations Committee. I'm wondering, and I'm just asking, maybe the parliamentarian, should this item be discussed at the committee level and then brought back to the board? I'm not sure. I'm not trying to create any pot, stirring any pot. I'm just wondering, since it was the charge of the board, or finance committee, that it comes back through that back to the board. Just asking a question.
That's a wonderful question, Mr. Hankins, and I talked to the chairperson of the finance committee, Mr. Anderson, who I see has his hand up, so he may want to chime in on that as well.
Yeah, good points, Mr. Hankins. I think procedurally that you're talking to, I think my recommendation would be that at the next Operations and Finance Committee meeting that we would dissolve the current committee and charge them, and it's a full board. I don't think the next ad hoc committee would need to come to the Business Operations and Finance Committee. I think it could be done from the full board standpoint, simply because of the slightly different issue, not just a budget, but also could be charged with addressing use of funds, referendum preparation. I think it's a little different charge. I think that could be a different ad hoc committee altogether. I would support another ad hoc committee. I think it should be a new and separate charge from the existing committee.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Did that help?
Clear as mud. I don't know if he's saying not go back to the committee.
No, and Mr. Anderson, please correct me if I am wrong in my explanation. The current ad hoc committee we have right now is indeed a finance committee led ad hoc committee, and that one is finishing end of this year, I think December something, I don't know the exact date. So what we can do as a board is we can start a new ad hoc committee and have it be a board-led ad hoc committee, and we can just request that the same people, the committee members, come back to this new committee, new ad hoc committee.
I'll accept that. I'm just wondering, I know we all don't want to be here all night, but why did we send it back to the finance committee when we discussed this, 6 months ago? And why aren't we doing that now? I understand we should recreate another one because the charge is different. But I'm wondering procedurally why we kicked it back to the committee level and now we're not going to.
It can be done either way. I think back then we were looking at more focused, just the 24, 25 budget, having them look at that, not so much have them also combine the thought of what does our budget look like paired with referendum. Not that they're doing referendum planning, not that they're doing referendum suggestions that we are tasking them with that, but it's very difficult to have a budget conversation separate or absent of the referendum conversation as well. So we don't want to limit them to saying, oh, well, you can't use the word referendum because it wasn't part of their charge, but we also want them to be able to come to us and say, okay, we are developing a 2025 school year with a referendum. This is what it might look like. Without a referendum, this is what we might have. Here are our suggestions either way or both ways. And if they want, if we can, and if Mr. Chady is up for it, even include some long-term planning that, as he mentioned earlier, we're not doing ourselves any favors looking at this year to year.
Thank you. I think I'm not saying what I'm trying to get out. I still think that the charge was brought out of the Business Operation Finance Committee and it was voted on and accepted. I'm wondering why we're not repeating that procedure for this next ad hoc committee, hoping that some of the members from that committee move forward. Now you're saying that this is a board committee. The charge still has to come out of committee in my book. And I just want to belabor that point. I just trying to go on procedure and what I learned from the last ad hoc situation we just went through, the exercise, and I think it's still this. We set a precedent, and my term on the board, I'd like to for future ad hocs. I think they still have to be born maybe at this level, but then sent back down to the appropriate committee that they are addressing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hankins. And if you look at policies 186 and 186 Rule 1, it lays out the procedures for the board establishing an ad hoc committee. So this is not something that just because we did it that way in June doesn't mean we have to do it that way. I think the board probably felt more comfortable then. It was new. It's been a while since the district has had an ad hoc committee. I may be wrong, but I think overall, people felt that the ad hoc committee did a good job. They brought some suggestions, some concerns to our attention. I'm okay with us either way, saying let's go, send this to Finance Committee. I'm okay with that. There are some other considerations that we haven't discussed yet, and that is in April, our board may look different depending on who's running and who's not running. Our finance committee may look different in April. The benefit of having it now at the board level is there will at least be 4 or more board members familiar with the committee, the work that they've done, if that makes sense.
Oh, sure, it all makes sense. I'm just wondering who's going to craft the language of the charge of said ad hoc committee.
We can work on that tonight, or we can, say let's. I mean, this isn't something that has to be done tonight, but it seemed to fit in with the items that we're discussing tonight in terms of budget. And I know that if we haven't learned this yet as a district, time is of the essence. Thanks. I didn't see who had their hand up next. Did you?
It was
Okay.
Megan, and then Brian, and then I believe it's
I think Brian was sort of like first. Board Member Anderson, do you want to jump in?
Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, and only first, just to clarify for Board Member Hankins, these committees can be formed either. They can start at the committee level and move up to the board for that language of what the charge is, or they can start at the board level. So it can happen either way. I think I like your idea of following procedure. I like that, which would mean by natural course the existing ad hoc committee would, if we did nothing, would cease to exist after December 31st because that's its end date, or by action and sooner than that. And then my recommendation, although it could come out of the Business Operations and Finance Committee, my recommendation would be that it would come from the full board. I think that it just shows a good solidarity for board unity, and that we're moving forward with more than just budget conversations. It could be related to referendum conversations and recommendations. So I think it's a little more involved, and I'd like to see the full board support of the ad hoc committee and have it start there. And then the full board could ask that report to the Business and Operations and Finance Committee. They could certainly do that. The full board can do whatever they like. So just to answer that question, Mr. Hankins, I think that's kind of the procedure that, in my opinion, would kind of make sense going forward.
Thank you.
Ms. Miller?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Board Member Anderson, and thank you so much for all the work that you and the administration did with the ad hoc committee. I agree. I'm glad we were able to work with this group of people. And I think just like looking at the language and considering that this is a Tuesday night before a holiday, in the spirit of like promoting engagement in the community and getting people involved who maybe would like to be involved, I would recommend that we follow policy, and I don't know that we need to take action to do so, but I think that since the final report has been given, this ad hoc, this like iteration of the ad hoc should be dissolved. And I think it would be a good idea to like set forth a new charge that would embody both advising on the upcoming budget as well as considering, I guess, like, I mean, ideally, a group of people who are interested in advising the budget for next year are also interested in helping us support and pass a referendum. So I think that's as Board Member Anderson suggested, that's a complex set of issues. Personally, I would like a minute to sort of think that over. Seeing this on the agenda when it was posted Friday was a bit of a surprise. But I really appreciate the conversation that we've had so far. So I guess my request and preference going forward would be to consider, and I don't know, again, if there's any action we need to take, the current iteration of the ad hoc dissolved with the intention of setting forth a new charge for an ad hoc, inviting everybody who is involved to continue to be involved, and maybe also to like publicly notice that, perhaps other people may want to join. I guess like maybe this is something we could talk about next week when we again have more information, hopefully about the upcoming referendum discussion, and then maybe form the charge of the ad hoc around both the interconnectedness, I guess, right, of next year's budget as well as the April referendum.
Ms. Levy?
Thank you, and I'll be brief because I only allotted the published time for this meeting, which was 5 to 6:30, and then I actually do have to leave for another meeting. One, I support allowing the current iteration of the ad hoc committee to dissolve. I believe the date is the end of December. I think that's appropriate. And Board President Johnson, you are absolutely correct to direct us to Policy 186, Rule 1. 1A of that policy is the Board of Education shall seek the advice of the superintendent of schools before establishing or dissolving any ad hoc committee. So if that has not happened, I hope that that would occur and the superintendent and the administration will have some input on what this new committee that it looks like we have consensus to form, what that looks like, and input on the charge. If time permits, I would love to see that information on Tuesday. If not, I think we're okay with giving ourselves a minute and seeing that on the next regular meeting. And with that, happy Thanksgiving all. I'm going to head out.
Thank you. And in fact, Dr. Garrison and I did have a discussion about the ad hoc committee. Well, it's out there in the recorded virtual world now. Okay. Are there any board members, and specifically you, Mr. Anderson, as the finance chair, have any reservation if we just bring this back on Tuesday?
No, pardon me, no reservations at all. I think similar to choosing a firm to help us with the referendum, similar to choosing whether or not to go to referendum and choosing one or two questions and how much, all those decisions, I think, I want to stress that time is of the essence. And so when this comes to Tuesday's meeting, I would just ask that, the rest of the board put their thought into these items so that we can take action and give administration the tools they need to move this charge forward. But I would certainly support that on a meeting as early as Tuesday.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Are there any other questions or discussions on the ad hoc committee before we move on? Okay. I've lost my agenda. Okay, is that where we are? Yes. Wonderful. I will take a motion for us to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Brian Nichols. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Tom Hankins. Any discussion?
Just happy
Hearing
Thanksgiving.
none. Oh, I'm sorry. What was that?
Say thank you and happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Oh, likewise, likewise. Before we adjourn, everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving and enjoy some well-deserved time off with your families. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? This meeting is adjourned.